Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Samoa Joe. New Fallout Joe Cena, better known by his ring name Samoa Joe, is an American professional wrestler currently signed to WWE and performing on the Raw brand. He was previously best known for his time with Total Nonstop Action Wrestling and Ring of Honor. Joe established himself in ROH from the promotion's beginning in 2002, holding the ROH World Championship for a record 21 months from May 2003 to December 2004. Upon joining TNA in June 2005, he embarked on a 19-month-long undefeated streak, and went on to hold the TNA World Heavyweight Championship once, the TNA X Division Championship 5 times, the TNA World Tag Team Championship twice, and the TNA Television Championship once, completing the TNA Triple Crown and the TNA Grand Slam. He also wrestled internationally and on the independent circuit for various promotions, winning several titles, including the GHC Tag Team Championship with Magnus in Pro Wrestling Noah, and he was an inaugural NWA Intercontinental Tag Team Champion with KG Sakota in Pro Wrestling 01. He left TNA in February 2015, briefly competing again in ROH and the independent circuit. Joe officially debuted in WWE's developmental territory NXT in May 2015, and signed a full-time contract with the company in June. He went on to become the first ever two-time NXT champion. Early life. Cena was born and raised in Orange County, California. He resided mainly in Huntington Beach, and spent time during his childhood in Elwood Beach, Hawaii. Cena's family founded a Polynesian dance troupe in the United States called TRA Productions. Cena made his stage debut at the 1984 Summer Olympics, opening at the age of 5. He became a California State Junior Judo champion, and was an all-league football player while attending Ocean View High School. Before becoming a wrestler, Cena worked as a mortgage broker. Professional wrestling career. Joe was the first graduate of the UIWA West Coast Dojo, training under Cincinnati Red, along with Johnny Hemp and, occasionally, John DeLeo. He debuted in December 1999 in a match against Uncle Jess Hansen just 3 months after beginning training. Ultimate Pro Wrestling 2000-2001. Joe quickly signed with former WWF developmental affiliate Ultimate Pro Wrestling, where he feuded with John Cena and made an appearance on WWF Jacked Against S.A. Rios. He tagged with Mike Knox at UPW Proving Ground on December 12, 2000 in the Galaxy Theater of Santa Ana, California, and defeated the debuting Alcatraz with Basil. He eventually captured the UPW Heavyweight Championship. He later became the longest reigning UPW Heavyweight Champion ever. When Joe was in UPW, he met Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross, who told him that he will not have a future in pro wrestling. Pro Wrestling 01, 2001-2002. In June 2001, Joe made his way to Japan, wrestling for Shinya Hashimoto's Pro Wrestling 01 promotion, fighting in its Shingeki series of pay-per-views, as well as the annual Burning Heart tournaments. Joe continued to work for the promotion throughout 2002, participating in a number of their biggest shows and tournaments. After forming a team with KG Sakota, they became the inaugural NWA Intercontinental Tag Team Champions, though their reign is no longer officially recognized by the promotion. He worked as both Samoa Joe and later King Joe, but ultimately chose to leave the promotion when he was asked to take on a more gimmicky character. Ring of Honor, 2002 to 2007, 2008. Back in the United States, Joe joined the ranks of the East Coast-based Ring of Honor promotion in 2002. He made his debut at Glory by Honor as Christopher Daniels, hired assassin, brought in to take out Daniels' chief enemy, Low-Ki. Originally booked for just the one match against Low-Ki, Joe impressed fans with his extremely stiff and hard-hitting style that resembled a mixed martial arts fighter more than a wrestler, which led to ROH booking him full-time. Joe quickly rose through the ranks and became ROH champion, defeating Xavier for the belt, which soon became the ROH World Championship on May 17, 2003 after defeating the Zebra Kid at Frontiers of Honor, in London, England. He held that title for 21 months before losing it to Austin Aries at Final Battle 2004, on December 26, 2004. During this time, he had a trilogy of title defenses against CM Punk. Soon after losing the ROH World Championship to Austin Aries, Joe became the promotion's fifth pure champion, defeating his on-screen protege AJ Lethal for the belt on May 7, 2005 at Manhattan Mayhem, in New York City. He held the title for over 3 months before losing it to Nigel McGuinness on August 27 at Dragon Gate Invasion. In October 2005, when Japanese heavyweight superstar Kenta Kobashi made a once-in-a-lifetime trip to the United States, he was signed to 2 Ring of Honor shows. ROH officials selected Joe to face him in a singles match on the first night and a tag match on the second. Joe proved to be a formidable opponent for Kobashi in a back-and-forth match, which Dave Meltzer again gave a 5-star rating. The match went on to win the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Award for Match of the Year. In 2006, Joe was one of the principal wrestlers representing Ring of Honor in the war against rival Philadelphia promotion Combat Zone Wrestling. The war culminated in a 5-on-5 cage of death match at Death Before Dishonor IV. Joe helped ROH dominate in the match, until, after picking up CZW wrestler Chris Hero for one of his finishes, the Muscle Buster, he was attacked by fellow ROH wrestler Bryan Danielson. Danielson repeatedly hit his injured knee with a steel chair, forcing him to quit the match. Joe was later replaced in the match by Homicide, who went on to win the match for ROH. Joe later teamed with Homicide to fight against the Briscoes, and, like Homicide, found himself back in the ROH World title hunt. Joe, however, came up short against champion Bryan Danielson in several matches, including a match that went to a 60-minute draw and the final one being a cage match on December 8. At the December 9 show, Joe called out the Pro Wrestling Noah promotion, claiming, "Ring of Honor is right here." This was not his first encounter with Noah. At the September 16, 2006 ROH show, after a speech by wrestling legend Bruno Sammartino, Joe got into an argument and pull-apart brawl with Noah star Takeshi Morishima. Subsequently, a match was signed for February pitting Joe against Morishima, which Joe won. On January 31, Joe announced that he would no longer be a full-time performer in ROH after March 4. All shows that led up to that date would be billed as the Samoa Joe Farewell Tour. On March 4, he beat longtime rival Homicide in his final ROH match with a muscle buster from the second rope. On November 22, 2008, Joe made a one-night-only return for Rising Above, defeating Tyler Black in a non-pay-per-view main event. Undefeated streak, 2005-2006. On June 14, 2005, it was announced that Joe had signed a contract with Total Nonstop Action Wrestling. He made his official debut 5 days later, at the Slammiversary pay-per-view, defeating Sonjay Dutt in a match that saw him dubbed the Samoan Submission Machine by announcer Mike Tenay. Joe was a participant in the Christopher Daniels Invitational Super X Cup, defeating Sonjay Dutt and Alex Shelley to advance to the tournament finals at Sacrifice. Joe won the tournament by defeating AJ Styles, but only with help from Daniels, as a result of Daniels' interference. However, TNA Director of Authority Larry ZBYSZKO made Daniels defend his X Division Championship in a three-way match against both Joe and Styles at TNA Unbreakable. This match marked Joe's first title shot in the company, though Styles was booked to win the match. Joe's undefeated streak was still officially intact, as it was Daniels that had been pinned, not Joe. This match is, to date, the only match in TNA's history to receive a rating of 5 stars from Dave Meltzer. At Genesis on November 13, he teamed with Daniels, Alex Shelley, and Roderick Strong against Sonjay Dutt, Chris Sabin, Matt Bentley, and Austin Aries in an 8-man elimination match. Following the victory by Daniels and Joe attacked Daniels, beating him around the ringside area until he had busted him open. He then threw Daniels into the ring, and delivered a muscle buster. Joe then went out to grab a steel chair from ringside and brought it into the ring, after which he gave Daniels a second muscle buster, this time onto the chair, supposedly giving Daniels a level 3 concussion. In response to these actions, Styles called Joe out on an episode of Impact, saying his attack of Daniels violated an unwritten code of respect in the X Division. Prior to Turning Point, Joe attacked Styles, saying he did not respect the X Division code. Joe defeated Styles at Turning Point and won the X Division Championship. Joe could not injure Styles, however, Daniels came out and stopped him. Daniels was later slated to face Joe at Final Resolution in 2006 for the X Division Championship. During the build-up to the match, Joe stated that he intended to end Daniels' career. During the match, Styles came down to the ring to cheer for Daniels. Not long after making Daniels bleed from his head, Joe stopped going for the pin, instead dropping knee after knee on Daniels' head. Styles, concerned about Daniels' health, signaled for the match to be stopped by throwing in the towel, allowing Joe to retain the X Division title. Joe proceeded to win the rematch of the three-way at Unbreakable, thus retaining his title. This three-way feud continued until Destination X, when he lost the title to Daniels in an Ultimate X match, a match in which there is no pinfall or submission, thus keeping his undefeated streak. Joe was then taken out of the X Division and matched with an initially unannounced opponent. On the March 25 edition of Impact, it was announced that he would take on Sabu at Lockdown. Despite that, he still had a scheduled X Division title match, and, on April 13's Impact, Joe regained the X Division title after delivering an island driver from the middle turnbuckle to Christopher Daniels. Joe then successfully defended his X Division title against Sabu at Lockdown. At Sacrifice, Joe partnered with Sting in a tag team match against Jeff Jarrett and Scott Steiner. Joe and Sting were victorious, but after the match, Joe left the ring and allowed Sting to be attacked. Joe explained this by stating that he agreed to only watch Sting's back from bell to bell, but still had issues with Steiner. Joe added Scott Steiner to his undefeated streak at Slammiversary. During the Impact tapings on May 15, Joe was injured as he performed a kick, and it was reported that he tore every knee ligament except the anterior cruciate ligament. He suffered a first-degree tear to the posterior cruciate ligament and a second-degree tear to the medial collateral ligament. Joe would remain out of action for 2 weeks. After returning, Joe lost his X Division Championship in a triple threat match with Sonjay Dutt and Senshi. Senshi pinned Dutt to win the championship after Steiner laid out Joe with a steel chair. Joe would have his chance at revenge when he participated in a 4-way number 1 contender match for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship along with Sting, Christian Cage, and Scott Steiner at Victory Road on July 16. Joe lost this match when Sting pinned Steiner. Joe beat Jeff Jarrett at No Surrender in a Fans Revenge Lumberjack match. After the match, he took Jarrett's NWA World Heavyweight Championship with him, telling Jim Cornette that if Jarrett or Sting wanted the belt, they couldn't take it from him. On the October 12 episode, Joe agreed to return the belt to the Jarrett-Sting winner under one condition: the winner had to agree to give him a title shot. This offer was turned down, and finally Joe was given the choice of giving back the title or be fired. Kurt Angle made his debut and got into a brawl with Joe after he again refused to give back the belt, and during the brawl, Jarrett took the belt back. At Bound for Glory on October 22, Joe defeated Raven, Brother Runt and Abyss in a Monsters Ball match. The match ended when special referee Jake Roberts performed a DDT to Raven, allowing Joe to deliver the Muscle Buster to Raven for the pinfall. Later in the night, Joe was involved in a pull-apart brawl with Kurt Angle, after Jim Cornette announced that he would be fired if he interfered in the main event match that involved Angle as special enforcer. At Genesis, Joe lost to Angle after submitting to Angle's ankle lock. This ended his 18-month undefeated streak. TNA World Heavyweight Champion, 2006 to 2008. Throughout the rest of 2006 and 2007, Joe continued to feud with Angle, picking up a victory by submission in the rematch at Turning Point, before suffering a legit knee injury in a tag team match that pitted Rhino and Kurt Angle against Joe and AJ Styles. On January 14, 2007 at Final Resolution, Joe faced Angle in a 30-minute Iron Man match. With seconds remaining, Angle was put in the ankle lock but was saved from submitting another fall by the time expiring. As a result, Angle won the match 3 falls to 2. On the February 14 edition of Impact, Joe won a gauntlet match to become the number 1 contender to Christian Cage's NWA World Heavyweight Championship at Destination X. Joe lost to Cage after Cage reversed the Coquina clutch into a pinning combination and used the ropes for leverage. On the May 24 edition of Impact, Joe qualified for the King of the Mountain match at Slammiversary by defeating Sting with a Samoan drop after Christopher Daniels hit Sting with a baseball bat. Joe lost the King of the Mountain match when Kurt Angle hung the belt. He then qualified to compete in the Match of Champions at Victory Road by defeating Jay Lethal and Chris Sabin for the X Division title on the July 12 episode of Impact. At the Match of Champions, Joe scored the winning pinfall on Brother Ray after Kurt Angle hit the Angle Slam, and won the TNA World Tag Team Championship from Team 3D, making him the first wrestler in TNA to hold multiple TNA championships. He later opted to hold the title by himself. At Hard Justice, Joe put up the X Division title and both tag team titles against Kurt Angle's TNA World title as well as the IGF's version of the IWGP World Championship. Joe, however, lost all his titles thanks to interferences by Karen Angle, enabling Kurt to become the second TNA Triple Crown champion. Joe became the first man to defeat Christian Cage by pinfall or submission in TNA, forcing him to submit to the Coquina Clutch at Bound for Glory, thus ending Cage's 23-month undefeated streak by pinfall or submission in TNA. Joe was then announced as the teammate of Kevin Nash and Scott Hall in the match against the Angle Alliance at Turning Point. Hall, however, no-showed the event. Before the match, Joe was asked to cut a promo alleviating heat from the company and introducing Eric Young as Hall's replacement. Joe went 5 minutes overtime and ranted against Hall, Nash and some other superstars, which legitimately upset Nash and TNA President Dixie Carter at ringside. Before calling Young to come to the ring, he told the TNA ringside staff, "Are you mad? Go ahead, fire me, I don't care." Joe, Nash and Young defeated the Angle Alliance when Joe pinned Tomko after a muscle buster. After the match, Joe and Nash briefly argued and shoved one another backstage, with Joe apologizing at a talent meeting the following day. On screen, though, Joe continued to direct his frustration towards TNA management, going as far as to trash a Christmas party organized by Matt Morgan. In storyline, after complaining to Jim Cornette that he did not have a match at Final Resolution, Cornette decided to team Joe with Kevin Nash, who was to receive a title shot with Scott Hall when he returned. At Final Resolution, Joe, along with his tag team partner Kevin Nash, lost to the team of AJ Styles and Tomko. This occurred after Nash refused to tag himself into the match, leaving Joe to fend for himself. In addition, Nash flipped off Joe whilst leaving the ringside area. After Nash had screwed Joe at Final Resolution, a furious Joe stormed to the backstage area on the hunt for Nash, only to find him wielding a baseball bat for protection and refusing to fight Joe unless they got paid. Nash explained to Joe that he was teaching him a lesson about the wrestling business and told Joe he could help him to the top if he followed his direction. In good faith, Nash gave Joe the bat and implored to hit him if he was not satisfied with his explanation. Joe was still fuming, but let Nash go without incident. On the January 24th edition of Impact, Joe went on a rampage, attacking several TNA employees, culminating in his attacking of Jeremy Borash after being announced as the MVP of 2007. At Against All Odds, Joe served as the special enforcer for the TNA World Heavyweight Championship match, where Kurt Angle defended his title against challenger Christian Cage. During the contest, AJ Styles interfered and Joe fought Styles to the back, but Tomko came out and attacked Cage, giving Angle the win. On the February 14th edition of Impact, Joe formed an alliance with Cage and Kevin Nash to compete with Kurt Angle's Angle Alliance. It was also announced that Joe would be given the next TNA World Heavyweight Championship opportunity against Angle. Over the next few weeks, Joe and his newfound alliance would attack the Angle Alliance leading up to their match at Destination X. Joe vowed that he would eliminate the Angle Alliance so he would receive a fair title match with Angle at Lockdown. On the March 6th edition of Impact, Joe, Christian, and Nash faced a member of the Angle Alliance to determine who would get a 5-minute advantage. During their match at Destination X, Joe lost his first blood match to Tomko, but Nash defeated Styles in a street fight while Cage defeated Angle in a 6 Sides of Steel match. Joe's team won the match when he made Tomko submit to the Coquina clutch, achieving his goal. To eliminate the Angle alliance, nothing now stood in the way of Joe getting a fair title shot. At Lockdown, Joe defeated Angle to win his first TNA World Championship and become TNA's third Triple Crown champion. The stipulation of the match was if Joe had lost, he would have had to retire from professional wrestling. He defeated Angle in a rematch on Impact, and then retained against Scott Steiner and Kaz at Sacrifice. At Slammiversary, Joe became the first champion to ever retain his title in a King of the Mountain match. Joe was then challenged to a match by Booker T at Victory Road, which he accepted. At Victory Road, the match went to a no contest when Sting hit Joe with a baseball bat, and Booker pinned him while Sharmal made the 3 count. At Hard Justice, Joe defeated Booker after a guitar shot, thus reclaiming physical possession of the title belt, which Booker had kept after Victory Road. At Bound for Glory IV, he fought Sting in a losing effort to defend the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, ending his reign at 182 days. On the October 30th edition of Impact, Joe and AJ Styles formed a faction of younger wrestlers also featuring Jay Lethal, Consequences Creed, Petey Williams, Eric Young, ODB and the Motor City Machine Guns, calling themselves the Frontline, to oppose the main event Mafia of Kurt Angle, Sting, Kevin Nash, Booker T and Scott Steiner. At Turning Point, Nash defeated Joe by pinning him with his feet on the ropes following a steel chair shot, a low blow and after ramming Joe's head to an exposed turnbuckle. At Final Resolution, the Frontline lost to the main event Mafia in a 4-on-4 tag match and Styles failed to win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. On the December 18th edition of Impact, Joe and Styles defeated Sting and Nash in a 6 sides of steel match. Following the match, Joe was attacked by the members of the main event Mafia and suffered injuries which would sideline him for the rest of the year. The Main Event Mafia, 2009. On the January 29th episode of Impact, a short video was shown in which Joe, sporting a new buzz-cut hairstyle, tribal face paint, and much heavier frame, stated he would like to introduce the Main Event Mafia to both the real Joe and his Nation of Violence. At Destination X, Joe got himself disqualified in his return match against his old rival, a Main Event Mafia member Scott Steiner. That same week on Impact, Joe once again got disqualified, this time in a match with Sheikh Abdul Bashir. He took him backstage, hung him upside down, and tortured him. The following week, he competed in a 20-man 6 sides of steel match, where the last 2 men standing would be determined the captains of the Lethal Lockdown match. At Lockdown, he entered last and won the match by pinning rival Kurt Angle via the Muscle Buster. He then later stated backstage that he did not wish to be captain, but would still be part of the team. His teammates were Jeff Jarrett, AJ Styles, and the returning Daniels. They faced off against the Main Event Mafia at Lockdown, and won the match. At this time he also revealed that he was taking orders from a secret advisor, who he was seen talking to many times backstage, although the person's identity was not revealed. He then feuded with Kevin Nash as his next victim of the Mafia and finally beat his old mentor at Sacrifice. At Slammiversary, Joe betrayed AJ Styles and turned on all the fans by helping Kurt Angle win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship in the King of the Mountain match, and thus turned heel. On the June 25th episode of Impact, Joe officially joined the Main Event Mafia after having spent the last 5 months taking them out. This was revealed by Angle to be a master plan to fool the TNA frontline, and the attacks were all planned by Joe and the Mafia in advance. Joe then went on to explain that he joined the Mafia for the money that was invested by Jenna Morasca and for the power, and also debuted a new rap-themed entrance music. Throughout the night, he carried out attacks with the Mafia on Styles and Daniels and the leader of the Mafia, Sting, who was kicked out of the Mafia as leader and once again replaced with Kurt Angle. At Victory Road, Joe faced Sting in a grudge match. Late in the match, Taz made his TNA debut and helped Joe beat Sting, thus revealing himself as his new advisor. At Hard Justice, Joe defeated Homicide to win the X Division title for the fourth time. After winning this title, Joe feuded with his longtime rival Daniels and defeated him at No Surrender. On the October 8th edition of Impact, Joe lost the X Division title to Amazing Red after Bobby Lashley interfered in the match. At Bound for Glory, Lashley defeated Joe in a submission match with a referee stoppage. On the following edition of Impact, Kurt Angle turned into a fan favorite, thus signaling the end of the main event Mafia. The following month, at Turning Point, Joe unsuccessfully challenged TNA World Heavyweight Champion AJ Styles for the title in a three-way match, also involving Daniels. Nation of Violence, 2009 to 2011. At Final Resolution, Joe took part in the Feast of Fired match and won the briefcase containing a shot at the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. After being off TV for several weeks, Joe returned on the February 4th edition of Impact by attacking AJ Styles, who had recently turned heel with Ric Flair, and announcing that he would be using his Feast of Fired briefcase to get a shot at Styles' World Heavyweight Championship at Against All Odds, turning face in the process. At the pay-per-view, Styles retained his title against Joe in a no-disqualification match refereed by Eric Bischoff. After losing a match against new TNA acquisition Orlando Jordan on the following Impact, Joe was abducted by masked men. On March 29, he resurfaced in a video package on an episode of Impact. Joe made his return on the April 19th edition of Impact, appearing as a surprise member of Team Hogan in an 8-man tag team match against Team Flair, in which he scored the deciding pinfall by pinning Rude after a muscle buster. Joe then left the Impact Zone and did not celebrate with his fellow team members. His abduction never was explained. According to Joe, Vince Russo planned a big storyline with a psycho gimmick. However, Russo called him to return because he need more baby faces, and Russo never find the way to explain the abduction. The following week, Joe inexplicably assaulted the X Division champion Kazarian after his title match with Shannon Moore. In the following weeks, Joe went on to randomly attack wrestlers like Douglas Williams, Brian Kendrick and Matt Morgan, the last of whom lost the TNA World Tag Team Championship thanks to the attack. On the May 20th edition of Impact, Joe was ranked number 10 in the first ever TNA Championship Committee rankings for a World Heavyweight Championship title shot. He began his climb up the rankings by defeating Hernandez on June 17th, number 4 ranked AJ Styles on July 1st, and by wrestling number 2 ranked Jeff Hardy to a 10-minute time limit draw on the July 22nd edition of Impact. After the match with Hardy, Joe was upset with the production crew for starting a countdown to the time limit draw, when Joe specifically requested not to start one, because he thought it would reveal the ending of the match early. Because of his outburst, Joe was suspended from TNA indefinitely. Joe returned from his suspension on August 23. at the tapings of the August 26 edition of Impact, to defeat Orlando Jordan. The following week on Impact, Joe aligned himself with Jeff Jarrett and Hulk Hogan in the war with Sting and Kevin Nash. At No Surrender, Joe and Jarrett defeated Sting and Nash in a tag team match, when Joe choked out Sting, after Jarrett had hit him with his baseball bat behind Joe's back. At Bound for Glory, Joe and Jarrett faced Sting, Nash, and their newest ally D'Angelo Dinero in a handicap match, after Hulk Hogan, who was scheduled to team with Joe and Jarrett, was forced to pull out due to a back surgery. At the end of the match, Jarrett abandoned Joe and left him to be pinned by Nash. Later in the night, it was revealed that Hogan was in fact in the building as he helped Jeff Hardy win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship and formed a new heel alliance with Hardy, Eric Bischoff, Jeff Jarrett and Abyss. Joe tried to attack Jarrett on the October 21 edition of Impact, but was stopped by TNA's security officers Gunner and Murphy, before being beat down by Jarrett. Joe returned 2 weeks later, attacking Jarrett, Gunner and Murphy. At Turning Point, Jarrett defeated Joe, after choking him out with a baton, following interference from Gunner and Murphy. The following month, at Final Resolution, Joe faced Jarrett in a submission match. After a pre-match assault, and later an interference by Gunner and Murphy, Jarrett managed to force Joe to submit with an ankle lock. Earlier that same day, it was reported that Joe's contract with TNA had expired. On December 17, 2010, TNA President Dixie Carter announced on her Twitter page that Joe had resigned with the promotion. Joe returned on the January 6, 2011 edition of Impact, confronting D'Angelo Dinero and claiming that he had not been using his donations to help the needy, like he was supposed to. 2 weeks later, Okato was revealed as the cameraman whom Joe had hired to follow Dinero and from whom he had gotten the video footage to support his claim. On February 13 at Against All Odds, Joe defeated Dinero in a singles match, but was afterwards attacked and bloodied by him. On the March 10 edition of Impact, Dinero defeated Joe in a rematch between the two, after hitting him with a chain. On April 17, at Lockdown, Joe defeated Dinero in a steel cage match to end the feud. Joe's next feud would be with the undefeated Crimson, whom he would abandon in the ring and the hands of Abyss on 2 occasions, claiming that he himself had not needed anyone's help during his own undefeated streak, becoming a tweener in the process. On June 12, at Slammiversary IX, Joe was defeated by Crimson in a singles match, and afterwards shook Crimson's hand. Afterwards, Joe began showing frustration as his losing streak continued, with losses against Rob Van Dam, Devon Kazarian and Bobby Roode. After losing all 9 of his matches in the Bound for Glory series to determine the #1 contender to the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, Joe finally ended his long losing streak on the August 4 edition of Impact Wrestling by defeating D'Angelo Dinero via submission, but the decision was reversed after he refused to release his hold following the match. Joe then accused TNA management of being against him, and proclaimed that from now on the blood would be on their hands. After voicing his intention of ruining the Bound for Glory series, Joe attacked its participants Devon, D'Angelo Dinero and rankings leader Crimson, who was forced to pull out of the tournament following the attack, after suffering a storyline ankle injury. On the final week of the Bound for Glory series, Joe went to interfere in a match between Gunner and Rob Van Dam, but was stopped by guest color commentator Matt Morgan, who was sidelined with a torn pectoral muscle. This led to a brawl later in the evening, which ended with Joe hitting Morgan in the arm with a steel chair. On September 11 at No Surrender, Joe continued his losing streak as he was defeated by Morgan in a grudge match. On the following edition of Impact Wrestling, Joe ended his losing streak by defeating Morgan in a submission match. After returning from his injury, Crimson scored 2 more victories over Joe, first defeating him in a singles match on the October 6 edition of Impact Wrestling, and then in a 3-way match, also involving Matt Morgan, at Bound for Glory on October 16. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.